Ah, sweet candies. Ah, Celestia, I'm alive. Ah, oh, listeners, I tell you something. Work can be stressful sometimes. And this stuff, it's so much worse than the smooths. And they always made it seem so fun in the commercials. Phew. Oh well. It all adds up to a pretty good story that I can tell you later. But for now I still have work to do. We still have one more chapter of this story. If you want to read along, as always you can find a link in the description below. And now, The Silent Shore by the Descendant. Chapter 3. The Elder Lord. The water washed over her, filled her mouth and her nose. At once Dash felt her breath escape her. She pedaled hard, felt her hooves strike against something. At once there was a feeling that she was being pulled, dragged. Something was tugging at her. As the last bit of her air burned in her lungs, she threw her head wide, felt it connect with whatever was pulling at her. There was a cold feeling, and the rush of water around her ended, and she immediately drew a massive breath. She spun around in place, fighting to her hooves, attempted to look upon whatever had been dragging her. And she saw the old hat and dearly familiar face of Applejack before her. "R.D.?" asked Applejack, her own face seemingly ashen, deeply set and worried. Rainbow Dash wobbled to her feet. She was cold, wet, and confused as a newborn foal, and her knees knocked together both from the cold and the remains of the visions she had seen while high above. The faces that... She went weak again, falling forward into Applejack's offered hooves. Together they sat there on the silent shore, the mist-covered reaches beyond the sea. As Applejack's warmth flowed into her friend, neither Dash or Applejack spoke. Each seemed to sense the other wobbling in uncertainty and deep confusion. Fear. "Dash, you okay?" asked Applejack after a long while. "You saved me," she said, turning to face Applejack. AJ, I'm so grateful. You were only in about a foot of water," said Applejack, her face still emotionless. "I thought you'd gone loco. Too cold for swimming this time of year." Rainbow Dash shuddered again. Another great tremble went through her. This one composed both of the shuddering cold and the realization of what it meant that she had not been so far out to sea. But I fell so far," she said. "If I'd landed on the beach, I'd be..." No, she'd fallen into the water. Deep water. It was the last thing that she remembered. Remembered as the faces... She shuddered hard once more, realizing that some pony, something, must have brought her up from the sea, must have laid her in the shallows, watched over her until Applejack drew near, kept her muzzle from the water. The vision of the fog, the faces around her unconscious body filled her with a new dread, even as she wondered what it meant that she'd been saved. Saved by the dead. Applejack saw Dash still shaking, still trembling. It was only when Dash looked up to her that she saw the expression across her face. An expression that she knew she must be mirroring. "Dash?" asked Applejack. "There's no Puritans on the beach. Not a single stick of the wreck. But I'm telling you a fact, Dash. Dash, we ain't alone on this beach." Dash's expression went white, and Applejack feared that she was about to be ill. Still, she continued, needing, begging to know if she'd been alone in her travels. Dash, did y'all see anything odd? Dash's shivering got worse, and Applejack moved closer, letting more of her body heat slip into the Pegasus. AJ, I saw, said Dash, wavering. I saw something I never want to see again. The two stared at one another, the wordless understanding flashing between them. Did you hear anything? Asked Dash as Applejack lowered her head. After a long moment, she took a deep breath. Slowly, the Earth Pony lifted her head and looked to her friend. Dash, I didn't see nor hear a single living soul, said the bearer of the element of honesty, the emphasis on the last two words. Not a single living soul. Dash and Applejack sat there, the meaning of their statements clear to both of them. There may come a time for exposition, but this was not it. Now was just the time to sit and shiver, to watch the waves roll in beneath the gray blanket. I don't want to be here anymore, said Applejack, nuzzling Dash to stand. Together the two ponies began moving from tier to tier, moving much slower than when they had first arrived. As they went, they were silent, noiseless as they crossed the spaces between tiers with little jumps and slides. Applejack nursing her still raw cuts from her earlier experience. At once their heads tossed in unison, and then they looked at each other in alarm. A noise. They had heard a noise. Together they stared, not down towards the water or back out over the tossing sea, but instead up the beach. They looked towards the line of dunes beyond where the forest ended and the beach began. The sound reached out over them once more. Together they stood there, staring up the beach as the sound moved from ethereal to very, very real, clarion and clear. Bells, the sound of tiny bells, and hoof falls. They gulped as the bells came nearer to them, as they saw nothing. Yet the nothingness had its own presence. It was so very real. They heard the hoof falls, heard the tiny bells jingling in time with the rhythm of the unseen hooves that went across the slippery rocks. They heard the hooves draw near, their bodies tensing as it became clear that they were angled towards them. There came the sound of a great, large creature planting hooves in the pools of water that sat among the stones. But no water moved in them. The sound of the breath of an immense creature was amid them, yet the mist did not part. Not until his head moved. To Dash it was as though the fog had left a memory. As it wrapped around the nothingness, the immense figure of a Periton seemed to disappear through it. From the hole it left came a sound. Words. Words she did not understand, spoken softly. Dash lifted her hoof to her cheek as a soft feeling went across her face. A small wet spot that almost seemed a kiss. Her mind raced. It couldn't have just happened. Applejack too felt the little kiss, her heart racing as the nothingness moved between her and Dash. As the sound of bells began again, they felt the presence move on past them, past where the waves broke across the stones of the beach, down into the sea, the vast, rolling sea. Great timbered halls and firelight, the snow across the high mountain fields, the old song sung across deep woods. Loss. With that, the fog began to lift, and the great presence disappeared from their senses. Dash looked down, saw her own hoofprint in the small collection of sand below her. She let out a great gasp as she realized the large hoofprint of a Periton stood beside hers. As the haze rolled away, All that was revealed was a great stretch of the stony beach, and the sky beyond in a deep shade of gray that fought with the blue. There was a hiss behind them, one that made them jump in time, kicking like wild horses. They turned to see the balloon touching down on the beach, looking to one another sheepishly as they slowly made their way to where the purple sat illuminated against the still gray sky. As they did, the first seabirds they had seen began to walk across the crevices, darting their long, thin bills into spots between the rocks. A seagull squawked overhead, and more birds ran up and down the stones in advance and retreat in time with the waves. The earth pony and the Pegasus looked over the lip of the basket and down into the still, bleary, tear-filled eyes of the unicorn and the dragon. "I don't want to talk about it," all four said in unison. A short while later they had crossed over the outcropping, turning around the bend to make for the peninsula beyond. 3 of the occupants of the balloon looked on in wonder as they crossed before a massive glyph, one bigger than the balloon itself. They looked upon the great jade eyes that stared out over the sea. The figure of a massive Periton stag stood there proudly, yet remorsefully. His vigil over the waters was as silent as the bells drawn upon his antlers. The remembrance of the hooves upon the beach and the soft, wet spot on her cheek smashed through Dash, and at once she turned to Applejack. AJ, do you think—" Yet Dash could not continue. As she and the others looked down over Applejack, all they could see was how she had pulled down her hat, clenched her eyes, and covered her ears as she lay at the bottom of the gondola. She knew, of course, that dragons eat meat. Spike would have to eat meat if he ever wanted to grow to his greatest potential, become the vast and terrible dragon that she knew he would someday become. He was already bigger than most dragons his age, and soon he'd be molting again. Whatever her own feelings about it, she knew that eating a lobster would do him no harm. It had been the money she was worried about. Her stipend saw them through many things, but it was hardly a fortune. With winter coming they needed things, firewood, scarves, and so she thought maybe he'd be willing to forego. But as they had walked wordlessly into the restaurant in Nag's Head, his eyes had lit up at the sign of the crustaceans in their bubbling tank. In the instant she had gladly agreed to part with a few bits if they kept his mind off of. "Here we go, folks," said the waiter as he and his bus colt brought up the trays. "Here's a nice little dinner for you." "Lunch, actually," said Twilight, looking upon the salad. It was too much. She couldn't even imagine eating this much. Her stomach still turned, flipped. Thought of the cries in the darkened woods. She looked up to see the same expression across the faces of Dash and Applejack. Only Spike's face was alight as the waiter cut upon the bag of mussels and cracked the shell of the lobster for the whelp. The waiter smiled to them all, his own heavy, old northeastern dialect becoming more obvious as he saw the crestfallen appearance of his customers. "We all are most glad you folks stopped on up," he said, trying to make polite conversation. "'Tis most likely the last weekend up here for the tourists, what with the leaves about to come down in the runnin'. No more leaf peekers. No one will be coming up to the beach any time soon, neither." "I can't imagine why," deadpanned Dash, her voice getting quieter as she looked down at her tiny piece of quiche. "We had such a great time." "Oh," said the waiter, laying the corn beside the lobster as Spike drooled across the table. "Were you up to the beach today? Go on up to see the Standing Stone? Can hardly think you saw much with how foggy it were." The four were silent. "Standing Stone?" asked Twilight, noting how Applejack turned away as it was mentioned. "The great big Periton in the stone? The glyph? Tells you the story right proper, don't it?" asked the waiter, laying the steaming crustacean before Spike. Spike, however, simply looked back up to him in surprise. "The story?" he asked. The waiter looked back and forth to them in confusion, then smiled. "You all didn't go to see the Standing Stone without knowing about it, did ya?" They looked at the table, fought to understand his old Northeast accent, tried to think of a reply. No, we didn't. We don't know why we stopped," added Dash, weakly. "That's a right shame. National treasure it is. One of the reasons we get tourists here in Nag's Head. It's a right wonderful thing, too," he said, smiling over them. "Yeah, it's interesting," added Applejack. He looked to them, saw them looking back at him in different shades of emotion. Worried that their concern and confusion may lead them to forego ordering dessert, he began to regale them with the old story. A few salty ponies in the bar turned around to hear the cherished foal's tale of their youth. "'Twas long ago, you see," he said, laying the serving tray across the stand, resting easily on 3 hooves as he lifted the 4th over them. "Back when Equestria weren't so old. Back just after the war with the witches." "That's thousands of years," said Twilight, looking to the girls, going quiet as the waiter looked back over her. "Sorry." "Not at all, miss," he continued. "This was when the last of the Puritan tribes that lived in the West came down to Equestria. They came to take their share of the promise made by the sovereigns to the allied races that had stood before the witches in their multitudes. Those that had stood with us in the war, had fought back against the invading army and consuming blackness that it unleashed. Now, only one more tribe remained here in Equestria. A small band, led by a great and powerful elder lord. One of the majestic Puritan stags. One with great raiment and many bells, symbols of rank, tied in his antlers." The 4 looked up to him as remembrances of bells sounding through the haze flit over them. "These Puritans, as all do, lived in the woods and fields in their lodges and got along quite well with the local ponies. As all do. Good friends indeed. This was in Hoofston and Manhattan, and all that were still just villages, and just little homes beside the sea here and there made up the entirety of the old Northeast. Which weren't so old then, as I said. Now, down across the border came a race, one that had served in the ranks of the witches. A brutal people, or so the story goes. History, they say, is written by their winners. But anywho, we know that somehow they got past the regular army. You have to hope somebody lost their job over that one." "What did they look like?" asked Spike, his lobster yet untouched. "What race was it?" "Who can say?" replied the waiter, adjusting his tray. "'Twas so long ago. We know that they were long things, with great long legs and arms that were clawed." Memories of the shadows of nothing in the haze sent Spike scooching closer to Twilight. "And that they were blood spillers." "Blood spillers?" said Spike, his arms crossing in front of him. "Aye. The most fiercely devoted adherents of the witches. Ones who believed that they could use the blood of their enemies to pull the witches out of the deathly sleep into which the sisters had placed them." Twilight, in reply, moved closer to Spike, the memory of dark magic hovering over the long, low table reaching back into her mind. "So it was said," continued the waiter, motioning to the bus colt to seat to a distant table, "that when this race came over the mountains and through the Everfree, they captured ponies that lived in the little homesteads along the border, began to gather them up, the poor unfortunates, like lobsters for the boiling." The scene of a family of ponies, a big stallion fighting, the mother uselessly trying to help her colt and filly escape down the road, filled Twilight's mind. "Now this last Puritan lord, he was waiting to go up to Servia, the land set aside for the whole of the Periton race. And his last ships sat here in the harbor, and beyond the toe of the peninsula. The news came down in runners that there were a fell people about. The lantern-bearers racing through the woods with the news. Some killed, the last one running far, far, far out into the sea and drowned in his attempt to signal the ships. Applejack's cup came crashing down to the table, her eyes wide. As the waiter cleared it away, he continued, "The bearer's sacrifice was worth it, though, for the elder lord of the Peritons sensed the meaning. He asked for volunteers to go with him, and he sped out into the woods to try to save as many ponies as he could, save those who had helped his people. Yet he was fighting an army, and as they battled towards the great stone circle," Twilight felt her heart go into her throat, "all of his lieutenants were killed, and he saw that he was too late to save one family." Spike reached for Twilight's foreleg. As he did, she looked down at him. She saw his mouth move and his lips tremble. At once, Spike spoke, Twilight gasping as she saw him lift his arms as he had when he stood inside the fog, beside the table. Spike's face was distant, and his words silent, almost a whisper. "Ere his noble blood spilt, and his court cast down to death, Lucas Magnus lifted up his head. There, amidst the foe, did the elder lord invoke the word, and it became as light." "Very good, lad," said the waiter as some applause came from the bar. "You do know the legend. You even spoke it nice and proper." "Yeah," said Spike, wavering. "Yeah." "But," asked Dash, not noticing Spike's discomfort, "what does it mean?" "It means, lass," added the waiter, replacing Applejack's cup, "that he called for help. Called out to those who had promised to help the peoples who had saved Equestria. Called for the sister sovereigns, the princesses." Silence hung about the restaurant. Only on the far side was their conversation and the tinkling of cups and plates. "And let me tell you, they did indeed answer," continued the waiter, "if the story is correct. And when the sisters saw what the blood spillers had done, they were a tad miffed." Twilight's mind raced back to the stone circle. She saw light cascading through it, saw Celestia's eyes alight, a most perfect and holy rage racing through the elder sister as she scythed her light across those who had harmed her little ponies. She saw the very rocks being scored by the light, ripping at their surfaces. She heard the reverberations of the words in the firstborn alicorn as her judgment upon them became death. She saw Luna's dark and terrible countenance fall over them, saw the very life being strangled out of them on waves of darkness. The Nightbringer's powers smothered the black magic already at work in the place, killed it, punished it, had been punishing it over and over and over for millennia. So great was the wrath of the sisters upon this fallen race, Twilight realized in that moment, that the very souls of the bloodspillers had been driven deep into the earth of Equestria. They had been unable to lift from it, go to their true judgment, until their victims were themselves free to splash in the waters of the Well of Souls. "Oh," she breathed, the realization of these facts growing behind her eyes. "So the myth says," added the waiter with a shrug. "Only Celestia and Luna know 'tis true or not." Twilight's mind flashed to the quills and parchment on her little desk back at the library. A look down to Spike made her realize he was thinking the same thing. "Anywho, as this was happening," he continued, "the ship that was waiting for the Elder Lord and his retinue caught fire." The eyes of all those in the booth stared back at him. "No pony knows why it happened. Some say 'twas one last arrow, alight with fire, that a dying bloodspiller sent flying through the air. Some say it were magic spell that came creeping out of the woods in want of vengeance. Could be any of those, or none. But in the end there was a great explosion, you see. They heard it all the way down west in Houston, so great it was." He looked over them, very glad that they seemed so enthralled with his storytelling, almost as though they were living through it, had been there and seen it. "It was so horrible that the Puritans were all killed. And not just the ones on the poor boat, but also those Puritans and ponies on the shore that were waiting for the chance to escape. They were all killed too." What, did the ship have a name?" asked Dash. "No pony knows after all these years, but we do have an idea of what it looked like," he said, motioning to the counter far beyond. There, under the dim light, stood a model ship, one almost exactly like the ship that had parted the fog before them. The group sat quietly as he continued. "Now down the shore came the sisters, the ponies, and this one last elder lord. Now you see, they all saw the carnage, the wreckage, and the silent shore gave them no replies when they asked if any creature needed help. So, the Puritan stag, the lord who had sacrificed so much to save the ponies, had to suffer the death of his people." He stopped, went quiet. The ponies at the bar hung their heads as well. "We've all been good friends with the Puritans, you know, especially here in the old Northeast," he added softly, as the ponies at the bar and the booth nodded in respectful agreement. "So the wounded elder lord," he continued after drawing a deep breath, "his grief became great, and though he fought to contain it, he could not. He wished to be with his people, and even though the sisters and the ponies there begged him not to, he simply gave them each a kiss and said one wish to each in his native tongue." "Tilgi-me," said Dash and Applejack in unison, their hooves going to their cheeks. "I thought you folks didn't know the story," he said, smirking at how they had interrupted the best part of the myth. We've got a working knowledge of it," said Twilight, guessing at what had happened to her friends. "Yes," the waiter said, lifting the tray once more. "Tilgi-me. Forgive me," he had said. With that, his proud hooves fell across the sand, the stone, and through the pools, and his bells rang out across the shore. As he went down into the sea, drowning himself with his kind. Thus ended the last elder lord of the Puritans to come over the mountains. The booth was quiet, and the ponies at the bar turned back to face their drinks and make small talk with the barkeeper. The waiter looked over the group of ponies and the young dragon in front of him, saw that they seemed to be lost in thought. "Soon after, the bodies were all recovered and placed in a cairn. Today, the ancient remains of that cairn sit beneath a standing stone, the image of the Puritan lord upon it. The names of the Puritans and ponies alike that were lost that day are written there. We get a few Puritans who come along to pay their respects, and not as many ponies as we'd like. Shame that. It's a national treasure, really." "It's something else," added Applejack, trying to lift her cup as she trembled. "Oh yes, we get ghost hunters too," he added, watching as the group suddenly looked up to him. Ah, here's what they wanted to hear. "They say that on foggy days you can still see them all. That the Puritans who were killed don't know that they're dead, seeing as they died so fast. It's said that they still tried to draw ponies down to the sea, to the safety of the ship. But they don't know that the boat's not there. So the ghosts draw them down to their deaths," he said, attempting a haunting flourish. "That's a damn lie," called Dash, pounding her hoof on the table. He startled, nearly tipping the tray, and looked at her as the other patrons of the restaurant spun to look at the Pegasus. Dash quieted, returned to her seat. "They'd still be saving ponies, lifting them out of the sea if they were weak, she said, seeming to hide behind her quiche. Maybe true, maybe not, miss, he said, forcing a smile. 'Tis all a bunch of hooey anyhow. Made up for the tourists, I suppose, if you don't mind me sayin'. He looked once more at the quiet group, realized that they hadn't eaten any of their dinner. With some small worry he looked upon the little dragon, saw that the whelp hadn't touched his lobster. Can I fetch you some more hot butter, lad? Spike put his arms across his belly and spoke in a fragile tone. I'm not hungry anymore. The balloon lifted from where it had sat in Nag's head. The ponies and the dragon now loaded up with the little travel trays of the food they had barely eaten. As soon as they were clear of any of the eyes of the village, they tossed it all over the side of the basket. Each sat in a corner, unspeaking. Dash stood, gave a low moan of displeasure, one that brought the others to attention. As she cursed, they too looked out beneath the basket. When they saw what had brought her so much distress, they too made unhappy noises. The trees of Whitetail Woods were now bare, the leaves having already been wiped from the branches by the magic of the ponies. The running of the leaves, and the Hoofston Marathon that they had been hoping to judge, announce, and participate in had already been run. It was over. Beneath them the colors of autumn had failed, been removed and laid to the forest floor. How long were we on that beach? Asked Applejack, her words solemn and grave. Twy, how long were we on that beach? The waiter, she said, making a sudden realization. He asked how our dinner was. Dash turned her head to where the sun should be, to where Celestia's deep magic should have it if the time was still the early afternoon. It wasn't there. It was lower, much lower, and far to the west. Twy, continued Applejack, soon stopping as she saw the expression of worry that flew across the faces of the other occupants of the basket. The balloon shifted course, now to the south. Their purpose for coming now firmly ended. As the magic shifted around them, the heat of the day seemed to fade, and as they came closer to the lesser mountains that ran like a spine down eastern Equestria, they seemed to pass into a shadow of doubt and confusion. Are you gonna write to the princess about all this? Asked Applejack after a long while, after the sun had begun to dip across the western horizon. Twy, you gonna ask if any of this was real? No, replied Twilight, moving to where Spike had laid himself, wrapping herself around him to share their heat. Why not? Because I'm afraid she might tell me. Applejack looked across the mountains, then to the forest below. It was stark, barren, lifeless. It was as lifeless and without sound as the shore had been, almost entirely devoid of any motion and life. Thus, as she looked down at the expanse of the black limbs below, Applejack could not get the worry that something might be looking back at her out of her mind. She moved to the center of the basket, nuzzled the two who already lay there, and joined them in their comforting embrace. Rainbow Dash continued looking out of the edge of the basket for a long while, watching the blue of the sea beyond recede until the black of the forest consumed it. As she watched, she listened very hard and with much intent. No voices came back to her, and when she closed her eyes, the faces were not there, as though it hadn't happened. Yet it had happened. She knew it had, and that fact alone made a shiver go through her. She turned, looked at the mound of her friends nearby. They weren't sleeping, simply huddling together against the cold that seemed to be reaching up into the balloon. The cold and doubt of their uncertainty driving them to one another. With that she walked to them, and they parted for her, making a space. With that the group joined together in wordless mutual support, the understanding that they had been witness to something beyond understanding. In that time, and that place, All they could do was offer each other their warmth, something denied to the dead, who they hoped had now been freed from their cold walks upon the silent shore. As the small group hovered above the whitetail woods, the hiss of the burner sounded out in intervals, breaking the silence of the forest below. Small breezes whispered through the dark, lifeless branches, catching in hollows and sending up the dead leaves in little flips and tosses. Here and there a crow sounded out. One crow listened, as his caws echoed far down the rows of trees, as the sound bounced off the black, stark limbs. He tossed his head, listening for a reply, staring off with his small black eyes. Hearing none, he raised his great black wings and lifted through the outstretched branches to the sky above. Here he moved to avoid coming near the purple balloon, banking away as the hiss of its burner illuminated the sphere in the skies that were drawing down into darkness. Inside the basket beneath, the four little figures huddled together silently and tried not to think of the vast expanse of the forest below. The great stark trees that seemed to be reaching up at them with pleas of mourning as they drifted on the cold air. The end. Thank you for joining me for this dramatic reading of The Silent Shore by The Descendant. And please go and show your support to The Descendant by going and reading some of the other stories that he's written. At least I think it's a he. If not, I'm sorry. Either way, go and read some of The Descendant's other stories because they're awesome.